So, we're going to see if the recording system that we're trying to get active in this room works. So, that's a good point. When you come to Q&A, if you could maybe stand up or at least really articulate your question, right? Because the recording is going to be focused up here, and we want to be able to hear the question as well. So, belt it out, right? Give it a good action. Put a lot of oomph behind your question so that the sound system might be able to pick it up. So, in addition to being currently a Fulbright scholar at Baylor, Alan is currently a professor in the School of International Relations at St. Andrews University in the UK. Is that adjacent to the golf course?
More or less, yes.
Yeah. Are you able to play out there? No. And was formerly a professor at the University of Dundee. Or University of Durham, I'm sorry.
No, Dundee. Dundee's right.
Yeah. University of Dundee, I thought I had it. He is widely published, both in a number of books on the subject that he's going to talk to us about today, which is Anglo-US relations, but also widely in areas of, shall we say, globalization and technology, including economic warfare, for instance, and the competition on aviation in the Western Alliance and also globally. So, very, very important set of issues. So, let's. And your subject today is primarily the special partnership, or the U.S.-UK relationship. So let's give a great Fighting Texas Aggie welcome to Professor Alan Dobson.
Thank you very much, Larry, and it's a real pleasure to be here. It's not my first time. It's not my first visit to the law school. I hope it won't be my last. And I always enjoy myself when I come here. So I'm going to talk to you about Anglo-American relations. It's a subject that I've been interested in for years. And I'm going to try to make the case that there is indeed something called a special relationship, notwithstanding all the suggestions. Perhaps it's in decline, or it's indeed perhaps withered away. President Obama, speaking in London in May 2011, declared, "I come here today to reaffirm one of the oldest, one of the strongest alliances the world has ever known." He acknowledged there was a small scrape about tea and taxes and some hurt feelings when the White House was torched by the British in 1812, but he claimed it's been smooth sailing ever since. Well, not quite. And was he really reaffirming the Anglo-American relationship as special? Which is what most, if not all, his immediate British audience took him to mean. Many thought that it needed reaffirming. After all, this was in the aftermath of a series of difficulties, the Iraq War, the Arab Spring, the economic crisis precipitated by the failures in British banking and credit and American banking service, and also in the process of Britain introducing very savage defence cuts. Well, the run-up to the Iraq War itself and its aftermath certainly created strong anti-American sentiment in Britain and huge political problems. It prompted the largest demonstration in UK history, and when war came, instead of rallying around the flag, there was only a 3% majority in favour. And that soon turned into a huge anti-war majority and deep disillusionment with Prime Minister Blair. And also the way Britain had been drawn into supporting what most saw as an overly aggressive and unjustified American war. An ICM poll for The Guardian in 2006 revealed that 63% of respondents felt Blair had steered Britain too close to the USA. That same year, a poll for Populace in The Times indicated that 65% of Britons thought that the future lay more with Europe than with America. 4 years later, there remained a palpable sense of British annoyance and grief at Britain's apparent lack of influence in Washington. A YouGov poll in May 2010 revealed that 85%, contrary to the idea of a special relationship, 85% of respondents thought that the UK had little or no influence on American policies, and that 62% believed America failed to consider British interests. Anticipation of an Obama bounce also appeared misplaced. 24% of respondents believing that since the Obama administration assumed office, Britain's relationship with the USA had stayed the same or had deteriorated. The Libyan crisis that unfolded during 2011 was kind of a case of role reversal. Britain under Prime Minister David Cameron and France under President Nicolas Sarkozy pushing for military action when Obama was clearly reluctant to assume responsibility for yet another military intervention. It happened, and was largely led by France and Britain, yet under the auspices of NATO. But it was not an easy situation for Anglo-American relations. And then there are the failings of the much vaunted Anglo-Saxon economic model, with the banking and credit disasters that have swept out to engulf the whole world economy. Is that model now so discredited that it will also contribute to problems in the Anglo-American relationship by revealing Anglo-American differences of emphasis within the model? Finally, there's the apparently ineluctable decline in Britain's power relative to the USA. Britain's expenditure cuts have brought defence spending down to barely half the GDP proportion expended by the USA, and has occasioned concern on both sides of the Atlantic. There will likely be no big bang ending to the special relationship, but surely one can already hear the whimper. T.S. Eliot, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Well, a word of caution. There have been many since the 1950s who've claimed to have heard such whimpers, but the relationship abides. Let me try to suggest why, but in so doing I need to establish a number of positions first. In the wide-ranging literature on Anglo-American relations, a Manichaean division has opened up between what might be called the schools of sentiment and interest. The former school sees shared values, culture, democratic principles, identity and kinship, all leading on to habits of cooperation and shared attitudes about how to deal with international issues as the source and the being of what they conceive of as the special relationship. The latter see shared and overlapping national interests, forming a utility or functional relationship that will only continue as special so long as the common interests abide and each side can be of significant use to the other. And one can see reflection here of the age-old tension between the contending approaches of idealism and realism in international relations theory. Whatever approach is taken, controversy and confusion prosper. Set at odds with both these broad explanatory schools of thought, Edward Ingram denied the special relationship ever existed. Max Beloff and John Dickey respectively wrote of it as myth in the 60s and of being no more in the 90s, while H.C. Allen professed its strong reality and David Reynolds its resilient, if changing, continuity until at least the 1990s. Reynolds conceived of it largely as a British diplomatic confection to try to bolster their world status and power, underpinned by the fact that Britain continued to bring something useful to the collective Anglo-US table. However, the ever-widening asymmetry in the relationship clearly threatens the continuance of such a conception of the special relationship. At the start of the 21st century, Robert Kagan wrote of Europeans, including the British, as being so different from Americans in their reluctance, even moral inability to wield hard power, that relations were fraught, and it was as if they were from different planets. Well, I guess one could argue that the events involved in two superpowers succeeding each other peacefully, beginning at the end of the 19th century and continuing through uniquely extensive cooperation together during the Second World War, and arguably into the Cold War and its near quarter-century aftermath, were always going to be complicated to explain and would attract a great deal of scholarly attention. But a way forward might be to see the special relationship through both an appreciation of the overall detailed complexity of its historical manifestation, and by measuring the idea of a special relationship against canons and norms established by international relations theory. The overwhelming weight of evidence provided by the historical contribution is grounded in strong, detailed, and substantial body of compelling evidence of the kind that might indeed lead one, echoing Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, to say of the Anglo-American special relationship, it is special. It just is. And that's that. Who would have the temerity to disagree with the Iron Lady? Unfortunately, assertion is not persuasive argument. One needs to demonstrate the overwhelming force of cumulative evidence that, among other things, leads to the recognition that when historical actors declare this is special, that it resonates plausibly. Furthermore, when considering the bases of the special relationship, I think it's a serious error to juxtapose interests and sentiments in such a way as to regard them as separate and distinct. What comes to be seen as an interest is often moulded by common sentiment, and the existence of friendly sentiments often leads on to common interests. This is a mutually and self-reinforcing dynamic, an important reason why the special relationship has flourished for so long has been the mutually supportive strength of shared interests and sentiments, covering feelings of overlapping identity, friendship and moral and political values, cooperation in economic, defence, nuclear and intelligence relations, common educational, cultural and recreational experiences, and close comings together of the British and US economies. It could be argued, and indeed I will argue, that such quality of relations transcends the normal relationships posited by the system of sovereign nation states. But more of this shortly. Turning from the historical narrative, the overwhelming weight of evidence, if you like, to international relations theory, what might this do for us in terms of trying to understand what might constitute a special relationship? According to the canons of realism, nation-states find themselves in an environment of anarchy where there's no Leviathan to impose order. All states ultimately have to ensure their own security by maximising power by whatever means they can, through alliances, or by standing alone if powerful enough in their own right. And on the premise, even in long-standing alliances, that today's friend could be tomorrow's foe. They also confront the security dilemma that dictates that trust between two nation-states can never be permanently established, and that one country's weapons of defence are always perceived by others as potentially weapons of offence. This theory rather dramatically illustrates the provenance and power of the concept of the independent sovereign nation-state. One does not have to be fully committed to realism in all its glory to see that there are some elements in this characterisation of the world of nation-states that rings true, or at least provides a type of practical reasoning to guide prudent statecraft. One way of establishing that a special relationship exists between states would be to see if they disregard these canons. And certainly regarding Anglo-American relations, these canons appear to be more honoured in the breach than the observance. Put simply, if two states willingly agree to share the means of mutual destruction, then one might suggest that a prima facie special relationship exists. The term prima facie is used because there has to be more to it than this, but it is a hugely important condition. So, the contention is that there is indeed a special relationship. sorry, I'll rephrase that. The contention is that if there is indeed a special relationship, it would be demonstrated by a weight of evidence relating to the interconnecting cultures and values, economic, defence, intelligence and government-to-government relations, all of which result in a breach of the canons of realism. Put another way, a special relationship of this order transcends in part the othering that normally arises between national nation states. Demonstrating the application of these claims to the Anglo-American relationship in a very short space is not easy, but what follows is a selective attempt to do so. So I've tried to lay out my claims as to where I think we ought to look and how we ought to think analytically to determine whether in fact there is such a thing as a special relationship between our two countries. And now I'm going to try and provide some evidence and then some further reasoning to justify the claims that I've made. One of the most salient aspects of the Westphalian state system is the strength of othering involved with sovereign nation states. For much of the life of the USA down to the end of the 19th century, the sense of othering was largely derived from a negative perception of Britain as part of the old world of dynastic power plays, oppression, intolerance, moral corruption, arising from the colonial experience, the War of Independence, and the 1812 War, and continuing controversy over neutral rights to trade. Then, as recognised by a whole cluster of scholars, there was something of a sea change in the 1890s, symbolised by peaceful resolution of disputes over the Venezuelan-British Guianan boundary, the Alaskan-Canadian boundary, their respective stances in the American-Spanish and Boer Wars, and by the emergence of a common Anglo-American concern about the rise of German naval power, even though, in pure power terms, they both posed far greater threats to each other than Germany did. How did all this come about? According to one eminent scholar, whose work I'm going to draw on very heavily here, David Haglund, the key factor was a reawakening of Anglophile sentiment in the USA, prompted by a need to distinguish English ethnic descendants from successive waves of non-Anglo immigrants at the end of the 19th century, and also to distinguish them from German and Irish Americans who were anti-British and pro-German during the gathering world crisis that eventually erupted in the Great War of 1914-18. In particular, compelled to assert a sense of otherness from those who favoured Germany, many Anglos in the USA began to re-engage in a more positive way with their English ancestry. There was an acknowledgement of shared inheritances, of political values, the common law institutions, culture, language, and kinship. All this kind of cultural coming together, of course, it's still a contentious issue. George Bernard Shaw once said, Britain and America are two countries separated by a common language. Maybe Otto von Bismarck got it better when he said the key factor of the 20th century would be that both the British and the Americans speak the same language. Such intermingling, the breaking down of the otherness erected by the sovereign nation state, is never easy to capture or quantify. Even those scholars who specifically acknowledge that there is more to the special relationship than simply the mutual utility side of things, acknowledge the difficulty of explaining the force of shared values, political, economic, security, and cultural interminglings. But some facts are rather compelling. Trade statistics do not reveal the depth of the economic relationship by any means between Britain and America, but goods and services trade between the two countries is significant, in absolute terms, around $180 billion a year. More importantly than trade, they are each other's largest single foreign investor, and they enjoy the world's largest bilateral investment relationship. Britain's total direct foreign investment is well over 5 times that of China's, standing at 20% of total foreign direct investment in the US. Though recently investment flows from China have begun to exceed Britain's, there's a lot of catching up to them. The UK accounted for nearly 27% of all investment from the European Union countries in 2009, which was also approximately equivalent to the investment in the US by all other non-European countries combined. They're also similar in having the largest venture capital markets in the world, and there is also important interminglings with approximately 1 million Americans working for British companies in the US and approximately 1 million Britons working for American companies in Britain. Over 7 million people cross the Atlantic each year between Britain and the US, and 3 out of the 5 largest transatlantic air routes service them. And of those travellers, about 33,000 are Americans coming to study in Britain, or I should say going to study in Britain, and 9,000 Britons coming to study in the US. These are ties that bind. But does the relationship at the higher and highest levels of bilateral interactions reflect a similar intimacy and depth? Well, maybe some rather chronologically random snapshots might illustrate that it does. After Roosevelt's entry into the White House and the launch of his New Deal, Churchill sent him a copy of his recently completed biography of Marlborough with the missive, "With earnest best wishes for the success of the greatest crusade of modern times." Almost exactly 6 years later, with the war in Europe underway, and Churchill back as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same post that he'd held for most of World War I, Roosevelt wrote a letter of warm encouragement, which, among other things, alluded back to World War I and the fact that he had also held an important naval position as Assistant Secretary to the US Navy. Already, there was emerging a sense of common experience, a sense of continuity that both their lives shared in confronting the threat from Germany. This was something also that applied much wider than their singular personal experiences and resonated out across both their countries. Forward to October the 8th, 1961, Harold Macmillan noted in his diary, "It is curious how all American statesmen begin by trying to treat Britain as just one of many foreign NATO countries. They soon find themselves relying on our advice and experience." Henry Kissinger, in an interview in 1988 and looking back on his time as Secretary of State for both Nixon and Ford, observed, "We had a degree of confidence in British leaders that we did not have in the leaders of any other country." And that was after much American angst in the late 60s and early 70s about British military withdrawal from east of Suez and frequent diplomatic complaints by American officials of being left to man the Cold War ramparts alone. But it seems that they were never left entirely alone, even if it were only for consultation and consideration purposes, as opposed to provision of British hard power. However, to the surprise of many, in the post-Cold War period, Britain did frequently deploy hard power, including the First and Second Gulf Wars, the Balkans, Afghanistan, and Libya. Robert Kagan's dubbing of the British along with the rest of Europe as Venusians could hardly be held credible after Blair's standing shoulder to shoulder with George W. Bush. In the invasion of Iraq, the US sent in 148,000 troops. The British sent in 45,000 troops. The US suffered 139 fatalities. The British, 33 fatalities. Proportionate to population, the British suffered more than the US. As he became Prime Minister in the spring of 2010, David Cameron received a telephone call from Obama in which the President explained, "The United States has no closer friend and ally than the United Kingdom." As dictated by tradition, Cameron visited the White House soon afterwards, and again President Obama spoke of a truly special relationship between their nations. Amid this barrage of classic Anglo-American discourse, Diplomatic cooperation has continued as well, and in September, the US Senate ratified a trade agreement which made the exchange of military hardware between America and Britain easier as well as faster. The Obama administration hyped the agreement as, quote, evidence of broad bipartisan support that undergirds the special relationship. Of course, tensions and disagreements and the occasional snubgate still occur. Famous recently, of course, was when President Obama chose to present Prime Minister Gordon Brown with a selection of DVDs that you can buy at virtually any supermarket. This caused a minor furore in the British press because of the lack of thought invested. Not to mention the fact that American DVDs do not work on European So, those kinds of things will undoubtedly continue to plague the alliance. Just to show that I'm being even-handed here, Harold Wilson, when he visited President Johnson in the 60s, brought him as a present a Ganex Mac. Now, you've probably never heard of the Ganex Mac, but it was quite popular in Britain in the 1960s. It was actually manufactured by a very close friend of Wilson's. So Wilson gave Johnson this Ganex Mac. Johnson gave Wilson a very nice pipe, because Wilson was a chain smoker of the pipe. Anyway, after Wilson had departed, there's this rather brief little memo to the President saying, Mr. President, unfortunately the Ganex Mac that Prime Minister Wilson so kindly gave you is far too small for you. So there are errors made on both sides, I'm afraid. Despite the snubs and the occasional embarrassments, the sentimental myth of the alliance, I think, will continue to have the power to keep things running smoothly. This kind of rhetoric, the rhetoric itself of the special relationship, used consistently over decades, is not empty rhetoric, it seems to me. It has real power and substance. For example, when it became known in 2010 that some British soldiers in Afghanistan would be coming under the authority of an American general, the British media predicted tension. Prime Minister Cameron waved such concerns away by saying, British and American troops have been working together without problems in many theatres over many decades, and will, I've no doubt, do so again. Despite all the historic tensions and disagreements that have taken place between the US and the UK since the Second World War, and there have been many, the sentimental myth of an alliance without problems remains both ubiquitous and useful, and a powerful component of the relationship. President Obama's senior advisor on Europe, Elizabeth Sherwood Randall, stated that the special relationship, quote, is so broad and rich and deep that it works along a continuum. This language is part of the institutional structure of the relationship, no less than the institutionalized Anglo-American summits, which are a further distinctive element of the relationship. All these ties bind. But in a short space, to show a weight of evidence that demonstrate there is indeed a special relationship, one can only supply a lightened version of the weight of evidence. And so there's always a danger of the narrative being tempted into discursive sallies and anecdotes of the kind just witnessed. So let us leave this approach for the moment, but on the understanding that I'm more than willing to add further weight of evidence in response to questions. And let's now turn to the breaches in the canons of realism, best exemplified in the Anglo-American nuclear relationship. Not only should this have never arisen according to at least one reading of realism, but it clearly should have withered away after the demise of the Soviet threat. In fact, of course, we know that it did come into being. What is less well known is that it has strengthened since the end of the Cold War. Even during the lapse in formal nuclear cooperation between 1946 and 1958, interchanges between Britain and America did not dry up completely. And then in 1958 came the Mutual Defence Agreement, which provided for intimate nuclear collaboration and which has been renewed periodically ever since. Following the Nassau Agreement of 1962, the US sold successive delivery systems to the UK for a submarine-launched nuclear deterrent. Now, this is committed to NATO, the UK nuclear deterrent. But after much heated argument, Kennedy also conceded at Nassau that in a British national emergency, it could be used independently by Britain. For one power to sell to another the most sophisticated of nuclear delivery systems is surely contrary to the canons of realism. This is not how sovereign nation states are supposed to maximise their security, when the more powerful nation state doesn't need for its junior partner to hold nuclear weapons. It adds nothing to American security. It's redundant as far as America's nuclear capabilities are concerned. Furthermore, agreement to provide an upgrade for the Trident system in 1979 also seems rather unconventional. At the Guadalupe G8 conference in January of that year, Prime Minister James Callaghan walked into President Carter's sort of beach cabin, where he found the President lounging around in swimming trunks. And in the course of the conversation that ensued, Callaghan explained the need to upgrade Britain's nuclear delivery system. Carter responded that he had no problem with transferring the necessary technology to Britain. Can you picture that? Prime Minister walks into Carter, he's just casually lying around, he's relaxing, he's in his swimming trunks, and Callaghan says, hey Jimmy, will you sell us the technology so we can upgrade our delivery system so that it's the same as yours and it's ahead of anybody else's in the world? And but of course he didn't have, which maybe he should have done if he was following the canons of realism, and say, and you do realise that according to the canons of realism, someday we may use this against you. One could hardly describe this as a regular way of conducting the most sensitive of defence issues between two independent sovereign nation states. The 21st century saw the Anglo-American nuclear relationship evolving in two new directions, which would hardly have been possible to predict at the end of the Cold War. With no common enemy left, the nuclear relationship should have withered away, but it didn't. Instead, it flourished. A major driver of this flourishing was the ban on nuclear testing, which provided one path of development for Anglo-American cooperation, and the other was the consequences of 9/11, when the major nuclear threat to the two states rapidly changed from being state to non-state actor to state. Possible links between Al-Qaeda and the Pakistani nuclear program added to these concerns, and a new area of US-UK collaboration under the Mutual Defence Agreement emerged over the forensics of nuclear terrorism and the need for databases to enable post-detonation investigations to trace fissionable materials used to their source facility. By the time the MDA, the Mutual Defence Agreement, was renewed in 2004 for a further 10 years, with little change to its content, the emphasis in both states was to sustain a reactive nuclear capability. But a key change that occurred after 2000 was that the UK concluded that it needed both to address refurbishing its weapons infrastructure and to plan for a new generation of nuclear weapons and delivery systems, and Britain started to budget to do both. By contrast, the US did neither. It looked to extending the life of what it had, while the UK invested in new infrastructure and delivery platforms. £2 billion was injected into Aldermaston, the British nuclear research establishment, for the construction of new facilities and the recruitment of a new generation of nuclear specialists. It was not until 2010 that a similar programme was started in the US. In 2006, Prime Minister Blair also announced a programme to replace Britain's Trident submarines by 2024, with a decision on their design and capabilities to be taken by 2014, as well as a programme to build a new submarine reactor. The UK has now moved abreast and in some areas ahead of the US. There are now joint programmes in areas such as the design of the missile centre section for a new generation of missile submarines, so that future US missiles will fit into both UK and US new designs. Indeed, at least one US individual involved in these matters has been heard to say that it's a pity that the 1958 MDA was written in the way that it was, because it is now hindering, not assisting, the types of Anglo-American collaboration that are needed to meet current US needs. I think the evidence that I've presented there is fairly compelling evidence of this close relationship. This doesn't happen between the US and any other country. Even so, there's still always the wider concern, often expressed by the special relationship terminalists, that Britain's relative power decline will gradually ease her away from a special relationship with the US. And the UK is indeed entering a period of renewed defence austerity. But as in the past, more capable, reliable allies for the US are difficult to discern. Within the Atlantic Alliance especially, Britain's leading status is likely to be preserved by a combination of determination to maintain a credible military capability threshold, a military modernisation process ahead of many others, and its scale of cuts is likely to be exceeded by most, if not all, Western countries, excepting the USA. Moreover, Britain is the most powerful US ally that is likely to continue actively to seek to size forces and distribute resources in ways designed to complement American strengths. Just a final comment here on this line of argument. It's interesting for the what I refer to as the terminalists, those who think that the special relationship is in terminal decline because of the widening gap between British and American power. It's important to ask the question, well, it's important to recognise that, but then to ask the question, but where else is the US going to find a more capable ally than the UK? And in 1945, Britain's defence expenditure in absolute terms ranked it number 3 in the world. Exactly the same position it holds in 2012. In conclusion, let me turn briefly to the original question of how and if the special relationship has survived the war on terror, the Arab Spring, and the economic disarray caused by the banking and credit crisis. Though I suspect much of my preceding argument has clearly signalled what kinds of conclusions I'm going to come to. Since the Second World War, there have been far more dangerous economic crises than the current one in terms of their potential to affect Anglo-American relations. I would single out the 1949 devaluation of sterling crisis and the 1976 IMF crisis that Britain was involved in. Both of those, I think, were really very serious crises for Anglo-American relations. But neither crisis, and they were serious. The IMF crisis effectively destroyed the electoral fortunes of the Labour Party for a generation. And I'll explain what I mean by that if any of you are interested in question time. But neither crisis created anything other than passive, albeit serious difficulties. And I think that was because linkages between the crises and other economic ones cut across problems arising in the economic sphere and prevented them from connecting strongly with power and status and identity and values in such a way that they might develop ideological coherence. In other words, for something to be really damaging in the economic sphere for Anglo-American relations, I think it has to take on a form of ideological coherence for it to be really divisive between the two countries. And there was potential in both the devaluation crisis of 1959 and the IMF crisis in 1976 for ideological coherence to actually form, but it didn't. As the current financial crisis unfolded, Anglo-American consultations became intense, as is evident from the references in Prime Minister Gordon Brown's memoirs, in his discussions with President George Bush concerning the crisis, and also in Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson's memoirs, with his discussions with Prime Minister Brown, British Chancellor of the Exchequer Alistair Darling, and Bank of England Governor Mervyn King. And as a result of the crisis, the British and United States financial systems have in fact moved closer together. For example, oversight of banks in Britain is now moving back into the Bank of England, making it more like the Federal Reserve with its prescriptive regulatory approach. The monetary and regulatory authorities of the two countries are working very hard to provide for enhanced coordination and cooperation in dealing with possible failures of large financial institutions. Differences in legal systems complicate resolution of such cases, but the United States and British legal systems have much more in common than those in most other countries. Of course, each country will in the final analysis look after its own interests. This was made abundantly clear when the British regulatory authorities refused to permit Barclays to rescue the failing Lehman Brothers as the financial crisis unfolded in the US. But the idea that the Anglo-Saxon model is irreparably broken, or that the crisis will cause long-term difficulties in Anglo-American relations, appears to me to be somewhat fatuous. The economies of the two countries were already more in step with each other before the crisis than, for example, Britain's was with Germany or other EU states, and with the development of even more similar financial practices, the step lock, it seems to me, has tightened. The Iraq War was a serious problem. However, from a broad perspective on Anglo-American relations and the way both countries tend to see international relations, it's perhaps sometimes forgotten that Tony Blair's position on liberal interventionism in an international society, his words, not mine, justified on moral grounds, laid the basis for his determination to unseat Saddam Hussein. In the end, this was a somewhat different road to that which George W. Bush went down in order to justify US military intervention. But note that Blair articulated his position on interventionism in Chicago at the Economic Club on the 22nd of April 1999, before Bush was even elected, never mind stepped into the White House. And I think one could plausibly argue that David Cameron's position on Libya was little different. Iraq did affect Anglo-American relations, and we saw at the outset of this lecture how public opinion registered negative views on the war and of the Bush administration. And even though polls in 2010 seemed to deny the idea of an Obama bounce, they did reveal the resilience of pro-American feelings in the UK in a way rather reminiscent of the recovery of a similar positive views of the US in the aftermath of the Suez Crisis. In other words, after the Suez Crisis, probably the worst event in Anglo-American relations since 45, there was a lot of criticisms of the United States during the crisis and immediately afterwards. But within 18 months, public opinion had bounced back to a fairly standard and consistent level. And that, in fact, was the same after the Iraq War. The same YouGov poll that in May 2010 reported such disillusion with British influence over American policy also found that 66% of those surveyed held a favourable view of the USA, and 62% agreed with the assertion that it is Britain's most important ally. Libya. Libya was not easy for either Obama or Cameron, and there was friction. But there was also determination on the part of the British to thwart Sarkozy's ambition of taking military control of operations out of NATO's remit and creating a precedent of kind of independent European military action stroke capability, something the US has always been strongly against if it were to undermine NATO. In the end, Cameron ensured that overall command and control stayed underneath the NATO umbrella, and the operation was, of course, successful, and Obama was eager to acknowledge that and praise Cameron when he attended the UN in September 2011. Obama said, "Obviously, there is an extraordinary special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. I have always found Prime Minister Cameron to be an outstanding partner, so I am very grateful for his friendship, his hard work, his dedication, and his leadership on the global stage." Back in 1966, when many in Washington thought that the special relationship was in rapid and terminal decline, especially as Britain prepared once again to apply to the European community, US Ambassador to Britain, David Bruce, wrote, and I quote, "The so-called Anglo-American special relationship is now little more than sentimental terminology, although the underground waters of it will flow with a deep current." End of quote. Well, sentimental rhetoric there surely remained, but there was more to it than that. And so far as the flow and the current go, well, what can one say? Some flow, some depth of current. Thank you.
We have about 10, 12 minutes for some questions, so I see one in the back. Alan, you can recognize these.
Thanks for your talk. It's there are a lot of questions I have. One is that one issue I take with your presentation is I think that you have the kind of straw man about realism, but everyone does, so it's a good starting point for a discussion. I think the most special thing about the U.S.-Anglo relationship, or U.S.-British relationship, is that we're both selfish, great powers. I'm reminded of the line in E.H. Carr about the Anglo-Saxon powers, how they say one thing out of one side of their mouth and mean another on the other side of their mouth. And I think in your tale, what's missing are two things. One is the role of threat, and two is the role of other countries that may pose a threat to either the United States and Britain. And I think if you weave threat through in the tale, you can see a lot of behavior both between the United States and Britain that is actually very selfish and has little to do with the special relationship. For instance, the rise of the United States, which is commensurate with the rise of Germany before World War I, forced Britain to choose whether it was going to remain committed to the Western Hemisphere or focus on the new German threat. You could also think about the way the U.S. treated Britain during the Second World War, when we sent over Secretary of Treasury Morgenthau to talk about Lend-Lease and other matters. I mean, if there's a special relationship, there are times that even in this special relationship, we treat you in kind of a hardball realpolitik way. So that makes me wonder, can the special relationship really endure the changes in international politics? Namely, as we pivot or look east, maybe the only thing that's special about this relationship is Britain's going to want to lash themselves to the United States because they don't want to be left alone to deal with Sarkozy or a militarized Angela Merkel.
Well, I agree entirely with the idea that there are strong elements of self-interest in the relationship, and both sides have treated each other pretty brutally over the years. I could give you a couple of examples. 1952, this is a time when the British and the Americans are trying to work out with NATO and NATO command. So there's no problem over the NATO command for Europe. Eisenhower is in place and it's fine, but there's an ongoing difficulty with appointing a Supreme Allied Commander in the Atlantic and getting the actual planning and strategies all worked out. The Attlee government had given a commitment that they would go along with the appointment of the American commander, but it hadn't been finalised by the time Churchill came back into power. Then, bang, Churchill's there. How can we possibly, the great Royal Navy, how can we have an American commanding it in our own kind of, not backyard, but back pond, if you like? So at the meeting with Truman in early 1952, Churchill is relentless. He's absolutely relentless and will not let go of this. And it's creating serious difficulties because Churchill has two main priorities at that conference. One is to re-establish what he sees as a deeper and fuller special relationship with the US, which he feels has deteriorated somewhat under the Attlee government. I think that perception is partly in error, in fact. That was the way Churchill saw it at the time. And the other was to try to do something about this business of the Supreme Allied Commander in the Atlantic. And they're not really mutually compatible, these two aims. By the end of the conference, what Churchill achieves is not a change of command. The Americans were never going to agree to that. And Churchill is peeved, to admit. He doesn't like this. He actually thinks it's a mistake. He thinks we know better than the Americans, and we probably did at that point in time. But what Churchill and his military officers have managed to achieve, I think, is indicative of the kind of special relationship that was developing. The British were very smart, as you know, we have a reputation for being smart. And so one of the members of the British negotiating team said to the Americans, look, what would happen if there was a crisis in the Atlantic and you felt that it was in America's national interest to reassert direct American command, meaning not via NATO, in other words, to disengage American naval forces from the NATO command, Of course, the Americans had to say, well, obviously, if our interests were running contrary to NATO's and we had to do something in our own national interests, then we would withdraw our forces from NATO, reassert direct national control over them. And the British said, okay, now reverse it. And now think about what might happen in the eastern reaches of the Atlantic, which is where the main naval battle was expected to take place if there was war, if there were war with the Soviet Union. And so the Americans said, okay, and they began to make concessions to the British. And these concessions were quite substantial. They made some technical changes about, they moved British control out to the 100-fathom line, and they also acknowledged that if there were a crisis and the British felt that NATO was not handling it properly, then Britain could reassert control over its own naval forces, which, so far as the British were concerned, and the Americans must have recognised this, that this basically gave Britain command over the battleground in the eastern reaches of the Atlantic. Now, what the hell's got to do with the special relationship? Well, what they also agree is that we shouldn't let other NATO members know of this. Okay, we don't really want this to get around the rest of NATO because, of course, it's in full harmony with the underlying principle of NATO, all for one and one for all. And I think that says something about both the brutality of the relationship at times, but also of the way that often accommodation was made between the two. That is, if you like, an illustration of the brutality of the Americans, but brutal because they thought that this was how it had to be. A lesser example of return brutality would be the way the British out-negotiated and out-manoeuvred the United States in the Bermuda II negotiations in 1976, 1977. We tied the American delegation up in knots, and the result was a disaster for the United States. It was an impasse in the relationship. It basically excluded them from effective competition at Heathrow Airport, the most important international hub in the world at the time, and was for many years later. And it then became an objective of American policy to try to get entry into Heathrow. They finally got it in the 2007-8 EU-US agreement. But
these are different than the Secretary of the Treasury coming to the British and saying, in 1940, we're not going to give you any arms or financial support until you spend out your treasury. That's a different...
Well, you're exaggerating it slightly. I hate to tell you, but I did my PhD on Anglo-American Relations, and it was pretty brutal. Morgenthau was pretty brutal. But of course, if you track forward to 1944, 1945, Morgenthau was much more sympathetic to the British because he had a misperception of the situation of the British economy in the early 1940s. And one of the reasons for his resignation, not the entire reason for his resignation, but part of the reason for his resignation was that he believed that the Truman administration was reneging on agreements that had been made at the Quebec II conference for the supply of Lend-Lease to Britain during Phase 2, which was the phase after the defeat after victory in Europe. And the period of time between that and the fall of Japan was expected to be something like 18 months to 2 years. And during that period, there was an agreement that Britain could begin to reconvert its economy to peacetime construction. Of course, the end of the war came much more quickly than we'd ever expected because of the atomic bombs, and Lend-Lease was correctly terminated. But Morgenthau thought that the spirit of the agreement, where America would allow Britain to begin this reconversion, because of course we converted to wartime production far more than any other country, including Germany. So we had a serious problem there, and Morgenthau was aware of that. Now, one reading of that could be, well, this isn't him going soft, it's him realising that for a new post-war economy to work, which is what the British and the Americans had planned for, they planned for globalisation. That's what they planned for. The idea that globalisation just came upon us is fatuous. It was planned by the British and the Americans in the Second World War. And Morgenthau believed that if the British weren't on board with this, then the whole thing wouldn't work. Okay. So it's a matter of balancing things here, I think. And I think you can give some examples where sentiment really does count. There's, I'm sorry if a lot of my illustrations are from the aviation world, but I do know an awful lot about that. One of the problems Margaret Thatcher had in 1980 was that we privatised British Airways, but there was an antitrust action pending because of the way that Laker Airways had been put out of business by what was suspected, and actually was, collusion between British Airways and American Airlines, United, Delta, and so on. Well, of course, you couldn't privatise with that kind of thing hanging over British Airways. So at the end of the day, Thatcher comes to Reagan and says, "Hey, Ronnie, can you do something for us on this?" And within days, the Justice Department lifts the threat of antitrust action, and there is a settlement out of court. And British Airways privatisation goes ahead. Kennedy at Nassau. I don't know where you want to start with that. I mean, one take on it is that Kennedy always intended to sell Polaris missiles to Britain, felt had an obligation to. But the main dispute, of course, at Nassau wasn't over whether the US would sell us missiles or not. It was under what conditions. And the thing that Macmillan argued for was, you have got to allow us to use these independently if we have a UK national crisis. And in the end, Kennedy says yes. Why would he do that?
What's the harm, though?
Well, the harm to you is that you lose control over it. Well, you say, what's the harm to us? Okay, well, why don't you sell nuclear weapons to other countries?
Other countries are in NATO. I mean, you're in NATO. We had one threat that we were both focused on. You need an independent deterrent to confuse the Russians and make that threat more credible. I mean, I think that's a very straightforward story.
I don't really think. And actually, the conversations that go forth that actually happened between Kennedy and Macmillan doesn't really revolve around those kinds of arguments. It revolves around arguments to do with Britain's prestige, status.
Well, I think those are important for us too. We want you to feel good.
Oh, that's nice.
Let's have one more question and then we'll finish up.
Hi. Thank you again for your talk. Can we just go back to the idea of the terminalists? And I'm wondering if you think that if in the future there would be a change in the mindset of the Prime Minister and how that might affect things. I remember before David Cameron took to power, he said that Britain should always punch above its weight within the world. And if that would change, just how would the impact of the U.S., for example, again, being so close to Great Britain, change the relationship? And also if there would be increasing relations between the UK and other continental military powers. I know that there was the France and UK agreement. And just again, how you think that might change things.
Okay. There are things at the moment that obviously, I'm a historian, so I'm not very good at this kind of stuff looking forward. But it seems to me that one of the things that was mentioned over here about America looking to the east or looking to the Pacific and so on, well, all that's happened before. I mean, this is what the terminalists were talking about in the 1960s with Vietnam. With regard to closer military cooperation in Europe, I can't see Britain's position changing radically. I think further cooperation with the French and some kinds of efficiencies that we can get with sharing with the French will go ahead. Just how far it will go ahead, I'm not very sure. Sarkozy was rather unusual, I think, as a French leader. But the basic point, I think, is that I very much doubt that Britain is going to all of a sudden begin to reverse policy and talk about having an independent military capability that is not closely associated and connected with US military power. Because it's been our view for a long time, unlike the French, that there's no point in trying to balance US power. This is just a non-starter. You spend as much as everybody else in the world put together on defence. Your capabilities are huge. So I don't see any kind of radical change going on there. Of course, over decades, there may be a gradually disengagement. But at the moment, the ties that bind are so strong and so intimate. I've talked a lot about the nuclear relationship, which I think is very much, many see that as at the heart of the relationship. I don't think there is such a thing as the heart of the relationship. I think the heart of the relationship is a moving feast. It shifts from one area to another. From 46 to 58, there wasn't a nuclear relationship between the two of any substance, and yet there was a very close relationship. If you look at the intelligence relationship, how we would disentangle ourselves without unbelievable embarrassment now it's difficult to believe. You know, Americans sat in the Joint Intelligence Committee during the Iraq War. That's our highest intelligence. When the National Security Agency computers went down in the 1980s, I think it was, America was very exposed. So what do? They connect in to GCHQ, General Communication Headquarters in Cheltenham, our equivalent. So this kind of institutionalized intermingling, as well as all the cultural and sentimental, is what I think is likely to keep the relationship going, at least in the medium term, and very likely in the longer term.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a very... Okay, I think there's lunch in the hallway.
Nice to meet you. Can I take coffee? Good. I'm tired. I'm considering I I'm sorry. I was get a one slide. Imf Crisis.